Why did you choose to move forward to access private insurance in New Mexico during your tenure?
So yeah, back in 2005, New Mexico was facing a budget shortfall. We were increasing the number of children served at pretty much an exponential rate due to some probably good child find and awareness in the state of the importance of early intervention. And going back to the state to request additional funds. We were already maximizing Medicaid. We had a strong relationship with our Medicaid office, and they were a full partner in paying for early intervention. But with all of that, we were still facing a shortfall. And so we started to look with our interagency coordinating council for other revenue sources. We considered family fees and kind of based on the experience of other states, kind of rejected that. It didn't feel appropriate for our state. So we started to look at private insurance as a way to fill a gap in our funding, and started at that time to talk to other states that had had experience in billing Medicaid, and it seemed like it was promising in terms of the amount of revenue that it could generate for our state. So it was really based on a funding shortfall that we were faced, and so we started to look in that direction of could we pass private insurance legislation. Until that point, we were really not billing, I would say, we were not billing private insurance at all. Our local providers were not billing insurance, and we certainly weren't at the state office.
And it sounds like then sort of one of the nuggets, if you will, was that this sort of started with yourself and the ICC. But as you started to build out on the idea or the promise that might have held, who did you need to convince to continue moving forward in that direction of ultimately either passing legislation or billing private third-party payers?
Yeah, so we were at the time, the Family Infant-Toddler Program, Part C for New Mexico, was within a developmental disabilities agency. More recently, since I left the program, it's now moved into an early childhood office. So we had to, work the approval process up through our division director, and ultimately, at that time, we were within the Department of Health, so we had to convince the Department of Health secretary that that this was an appropriate process. One thing, insurance in New Mexico is administered under or regulated under a superintendent of insurance, so we had to check things out there, and they were very helpful in helping us think through where in statute. If we had gone through without them, we wouldn't have understood that there are actually several statutes that apply to different types of insurance, either managed care or fee-for-service, different types of insurance. So they were very helpful. And then in terms of, so that was the approval process. I don't know that it went all the way to the governor's office, to be honest. It may have come up in discussions, but I wasn't privy to that. And then in terms of support, we already had the support of the Interagency Coordinating Council, and of course there are providers on that, but we also talk to providers more generally, and a number of the providers are in an association. So convincing that association that this was a worthy endeavor. And so the providers were convinced by talking to some other states that had gone through this. And one of the things that they told us strongly was that they would be behind it if there was no administrative burden on them. They felt like it would be hard to take on all of the back office roles of claiming and having to hire folks that could do that claiming. And so they felt like they could really get behind the insurance legislation if the state of New Mexico took on that administrative role of doing the claiming. So that was something we committed to right from the beginning, that we would do that. So in terms of the administrative process, New Mexico took the passage of the private insurance legislation as an opportunity to upgrade our database, our electronic database, and we realized we were going to need a more robust system to be able to generate data that was going to be used. And as I've said previously, we committed to providers that we would do the administrative claiming at the state level. And so we upgraded our data system to a web-based system, and the delivered services down to every minute of service. Providers enter all of the services provided and enter the time that was provided, the location. We already had a fee-for-service kind of system with individual rates for services. And so those data are collected on a monthly basis, or at the end of the month. Providers have until the 10th of the following month to get all data in. And then our billing agent collects the data from our database, basically a data dump, that then they take and convert into claims. Our billing agent in New Mexico both does private insurance claiming and Medicaid claiming. So the first cut is that they know, because we have the eligibility file from our Medicaid office, they know who of the children's records are Medicaid. So they process the claims to Medicaid for all of the Medicaid eligible children. We then know of the children who are not Medicaid who have private insurance, because we have that information in the data system. And here's maybe something that's important to know, is that New Mexico uses what's sometimes called a pay and chase system. Is we committed to providers that they wouldn't wait for payment based on our ability to actually claim the third party or private insurance. So the Department of Health, or now the Early Childhood Department, fully reimburses the provider for all services provided. And then we do the pay and chase. So we've paid, and then we chase the claim with the private insurance, which can take some time. Some of the health plans pay right away. Sometimes there's some back and forth on the claim, but the provider has already received full payment for that service. And so our billing agent is then working with the health plans to get that reimbursement. That reimbursement then comes as a payment to the Department of Health, or now our Early Childhood Department, as revenue that we can use to administer the whole early intervention program. So I hope that helps in terms of understanding how the process. It wasn't until after we put it in place we realized what we had actually put in place was a sometimes referred to as a central billing process, that all the data is coming into the central office, and then we're working out where the payments are going to come from, or who are the payers. And of course, the Part C program is the payer of for folks that don't have Medicaid and don't have private insurance.
It sounds like your experience, though, mirrored that of Massachusetts, in the sense that we always said no copays, no deductibles.
So one thing we did in New Mexico, and it was really a commitment to our interagency coordinating council, is that passing insurance legislation was not have an adverse effect on families in terms of their need to be now paying copays and deductibles. And part of that was mirroring our language on what Massachusetts had done. And so in this area, we sort of modeled our legislation around that. And so what that means is that because we know health plans won't always pick up the full cost of service, so if our rate is $120 an hour, usually services are 15 minutes, but let's just talk in hours, and the health plan pays $100 of that, typically a therapy office or a doctor's office would then be expecting the family to pay the copay. Maybe that's the $20 difference, or that there's, well, let's stick with copays. What we made a commitment is we would not be expecting our providers, nor in our central office would we be going after the family for that $20 copay. Basically, what that means is that the state is eating or understanding that of the $120 we billed, we got $100 back. Still $100 we wouldn't have got if we didn't have private insurance. The same is somewhat true, but it's a little harder to understand, is the deductibles. As we know from most of us having private insurance, that many plans have deductibles. Sometimes those are quite high, $500, $1,000, and that families wouldn't be able to get any benefit until they had paid that deductible. We made a commitment that we wouldn't be expecting families to pay for early intervention services to their local provider or to the state if they hadn't met that deductible. For their health plan, they think that we did go after them for the full $120. And so in some ways, that gets credited towards their payment of their deductible. And so we believe that this is actually, not only is it not charging families copays and deductibles, it's helping families meet their deductible. And then when they do have health issues, rather than early intervention costs, their health plan will have seen them as meeting that deductible. So we felt like that was important in New Mexico, that there were no costs to families, as we didn't want that to be a disincentive for families actually being enrolled or getting the services on their IFSP.
Did you have to prepare additional information for the various individuals or groups that wanted to know what the implications of this were? And did you already have that data available at your level?
So we had to do a projection of how much revenue this would generate in order to see whether it was even worth it, because we knew it was going to be a pretty heavy lift, a lot of not just passing the legislation, but then administering the program after that. So we had to do a projection. So that was, we had pretty strong data at that time already through our electronic database to let us know the number of services being provided. What we had to work on was the percentage of children with private insurance. We're a state, New Mexico's a state that has a high percentage of children on Medicaid already. Then we have military families, a high Native American population getting most of this healthcare through Indian Health Service. So we had to really work to work out the percentage of children that had private insurance and private insurance plans that would be applicable, or would this private insurance would apply to. So that was the biggest lift, I think. The other piece is working out the implications for families, and so not just what we would generate in revenue, but would there be a potential cost to families. So we had, and that was actually something we put in the legislation, was that this would not affect costs for families.
Did you build in issues related to implementation costs, both for yourself, but I guess more so for the provider community, even though you said that they didn't have to do any of the back office work, or apparently probably still don't? And then anything relative to maintenance costs, and maybe that's a non-issue as well, as it may relate to the fact that the state is actually doing the billing.
So we did do some projections of actually the implementation and working out that we would have an administrative cost. We pretty early on knew that we didn't want to hire state staff to process claims, take on that administrative burden. We had already committed to providers that we wouldn't be expecting them to do the claiming. So it really came down to the fact that we would be issuing an RFP for a billing agent that would process claims for us. And I'm trying to think at the time when we passed the legislation whether we had a firm sense of what that would be. And I think the answer truthfully would be no, but that we knew that of the, let's say we projected $2.5 million of revenue that we would collect, that maybe 10 to 15% would be an administrative cost that we would need to put out in an RFP for someone to process those claims. But I don't think we had any strong, at that time, estimation of what that administrative cost would be.
And by the time you left, what was the level of financial support that you were generating through private insurance?
We were getting somewhere in the region of 1.5 to 1.8 million dollars in revenue. It never ended up being quite what we had expected, which was a little disappointing. And I think there are some efficiencies that probably could be put in place, chasing up on claim denials and such, that probably could increase that revenue. Again, New Mexico, unlike some other states, has a fairly small, I think in our projections when we passed the legislation, it was something like 20% of families had private insurance that would be covered by the insurance legislation. And I know that that's very low compared to a lot of states based on our poverty rate and some of the other issues of military families, Native American families, and just a high percentage of families on Medicaid.
Right. And as I think you've already certainly hinted at strongly or said outright, is that a number of those, particularly that self-insure, may make, I'm assuming, a similar decision that they make in many states, is that they can choose to pay, or they don't have to pay, or they could pay some portion thereof. And as well as what you've already cited of TRICARE or other military coverage, you've just got a lot of people who are theoretically in that 20 some odd percent that are insured, but the insurance isn't necessarily going to cover the service.
Yes, I mean, I learned a lot about the insurance world and the insurance language, perhaps more than I ever wanted to. And so self-insured plans, ERISA, a lot of understanding, and that's something I would advise states to do. Is I took that on a lot as the Part C director of learning all of the ins and outs of the insurance world and shepherding all of that through, both the passage of the legislation itself and then the implementation. And I think states would do well by bringing someone on to do that work, whether it's dedicating a state person to do that for them, to be dedicated in this role, rather than it all falling on the shoulders of the Part C director, or bring someone on perhaps as a contract, or to really dedicate the work, because it is a lot of work to get both the legislation, and perhaps even more so than put in place the administration pieces to make sure it's successful, or actually that it's implemented. And having someone dedicated to that, I think, would be helpful for states.
I think that's a very interesting comment. And one that we're going to interview a colleague that I worked with in Massachusetts who actually came out of the insurance industry. But I absolutely agree with your position that I think someone learning that language or already knowing that language that can guide you, because otherwise it's another skill set that I think most of us coming up within the early intervention community certainly didn't have when we arrived in our jobs.
Yeah.
So speak, if you will, if there were any, did you have stakeholders who opposed the change? Maybe speak to the insurance community, private insurance community's position. Did they oppose you, or did they basically not fight you in terms of going forward?
So the passage of our legislation in New Mexico went very smoothly. We were able to pass the legislation the first time round. We really, when the legislation was introduced in committees before full passage, we were always looking around the room for the insurance lobby to be opposing it, and they really didn't. And I think what we did well to mitigate that was involving the three big insurance plans. There are more plans than that, but there are three big ones that cover the majority of New Mexico citizens. And we engaged them in the process, including the drafting of the legislation. And we, again, had a couple of other states that had already passed the legislation, video conference in, and talked to us about their experience, and the insurance folks were in the room. Now, it wasn't the executive directors or the actuarial folks from those companies, but mid-level managers, perhaps, that oversaw children's services. And so we engaged them in the process. So I think what happened is that they saw the writing on the wall. They saw that this was probably going to pass. They wanted to make sure that it was advantageous to them. And one of the things that we did in New Mexico was include a cap. Whether that was the right thing to do or not, I think it helped the passage of the law, because what that enabled the health plans to do was to say, okay, if the cap is $3,500, which is what we passed, they could go back to their actuarial folks and say, okay, if we have 10-12% of our birth to three population in this receiving early intervention, and they were all to meet that cap, what would the hit be to our health plan? And I think they crunched those numbers and determined that really, in the scheme of things, it was pocket change to them. It was a small amount of money, and that they weren't then going to need to lobby against the legislation, because really the impact was small. I think going back, I think that cap was perhaps too conservative. We probably should have had it higher, and there are talks about removing that cap, but that's what we did. So the three big health plans were supportive of it. Well, I don't know about supportive. They were not going to oppose us, and but we still felt like there might be some other health plans out there, and that didn't happen. The bill passed on its in the first year.
The fact that you had Medicaid coverage already, and presuming that was a fee-for-service, reimbursed service, was that helpful in terms of working with the insurers, knowing that you already had experience in terms of insurance billing?
I do think having a strong Medicaid system in place already did help us pass the insurance. In New Mexico, it is a fee-for-service. We've been successful as the state has introduced and then redesigned managed care. I think at least twice now, we've been successful in keeping early intervention carved out of that managed care. So early intervention and school-based services are still paid on a fee-for-service basis outside of managed care. I do think it helped us in the argument for passing private insurance, and the line that we would use is that if the public insurance payer, which is Medicaid, sees these services as medically necessary, and we know that that is a requirement of Medicaid, that they see these services as medically necessary, that creates a strong argument to the private insurance that if the public insurer, Medicaid, is paying for these services and they see them as medically necessary, then why would we think that these services would not be applicable for payment under a private insurance plan, who may be seeing these as educational? After all, this is an education law that we're working within, and they may just not be familiar with some of the services and developmental specialists, whereas they may be more understanding of an OT, PT, SLP, nurse, and some of the other services. But if the state is successful in having those services funded and the whole comprehensive package of early intervention services funded through Medicaid, then I think that creates a strong argument that private insurers should be paying for those services just like Medicaid.